Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Nyaradzi, also known as Mutos. Welcome to the Connection Desk. We're continuing in Acts chapter 18. Today we'll be reading from verses 9 through to verse 17. Last time we were in again in Corinth, and we're looking at the synagogue. When we ended off, we talked about the synagogue, Paul preaching in the synagogue. At the beginning, we talked about tent making, and then we talked about Priscilla and Aquila, and then we talked about Timothy and Titus coming with the gift from Macedonia. And then after that, there's the mention of the fact that Paul devoted all his time now to preaching the gospel. And then in the synagogue, after he preaches in the synagogue, there's a abusive response to him. And when they are abusive to him, he shakes his clothes, and then he goes off into the next door, and he starts talking to the people next door, to Titius, Justus, and they began a church from Titius Justus' house. So we get now into verses 9 through to 17. It seems Paul might have had some concerns about what would happen. You see, the pattern that would happen if you read the accounts so far is that the Jewish people would stir up trouble in whatever city he got into, and likely he was probably thinking about what might happen now that he had stirred up, or he had actually shook his clothes off, and he had gone to the Gentiles and did what he did. And maybe he was concerned that this was going to cause him problems. But there's a vision that God gives him, a reassurance. And let's start from there. One night, the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack you and harm you, because I have many people in this city. So Paul stayed for 1.5 years teaching them the word of God. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him into court. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. So he had them ejected from the court. Then they all turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue ruler, and beat him in front of the court. But Gallio showed no concern whatever. So let's talk first about guidance and this vision. One of the ways God speaks is through visions and dreams. And Paul seems to be a person that God spoke to through visions. If you remember Acts chapter 16:9, the incident, the Macedonian vision where he saw a man from Macedonia calling him to come over. And then here now we get Acts 18:9 again, he gets a vision which reassures him to stay in Corinth. And God said he had many people in that city and wanted Paul to stay there. He says he stayed for 1.5 years. This will be one of the longest stays in any place that is recorded in the book of Acts. So he stayed for 1.5 years in Corinth. So far up to now, it's the longest stay. The longest stay was probably in Ephesus, which goes into the next chapter 19. Is longer than 1 Corinthians. But up to now, this is the longest stay that we have. So he stays for 1.5 years in this place. And after this reassurance, we get this incident that Luke then records. It talks about this man called Gallio. Gallio was a proconsular or governor of Achaia. Remember, Achaia is where Paul is now, where they now are. Now Timothy and Titus had come, and there was a team now. Originally, he had just gone by himself to Corinth. So he had gone to Athens and then Corinth by himself. And that is in the region of Achaia. So they were in the region of Achaia, and the proconsul or governor of Achaia was this man called Gallio. He had legal powers to pronounce judgments which would be legal precedent for the Roman Empire. So in this instance, this judgment that he could have passed would have had ramifications not just for Corinth, but for Christianity within the empire. The meeting was held at the tribunal, which was in the open air in the marketplace. And Rome did not permit the propagation of new religions. It would want to have religions that it knew and it legalized. So there were what was called religio licita, which is legal religions or religions that are known, and then religio illicita, which is illegal religions which have not got permission by the Roman Empire or are not known by the Roman Empire. So Rome did not permit the propagation of these new religions, but Judaism was an accepted and established belief in the Roman Empire. So the accusation that they brought was that Christianity was not Judaism. It was a cult that they were saying was distinct from Judaism, and they wanted Gallio to understand that and make that pronouncement against Christianity. So Paul was about to speak before Gallio interjected. So he was, just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio interjected, and there's an impatient and brush-offish feel to the communication that you get from Gallio. And Gallio abruptly dismissed the charges against Paul as an internal matter to be decided by their own judicial systems. This is your problem. This is not my issue. Fix it yourselves. It's a Jewish problem. You're talking about your laws and your words and so on. So it was not a Roman court issue, and they were ejected. That would lay a precedent and would make Christianity a legal religion, because as far as they were concerned, it was part of Judaism. And they didn't want to get into all the detail. And you can see God intervening and just coming in on behalf of Paul and the church at that time. Later on, the Romans do make Christianity religio illicita, but not at this point. And we see God's hand working with Gallio. God had first told Paul, reassured him that he would suffer no harm in this place. They tried to harm him. They still tried to do it. But Gallio is the one that God uses to stop them. And, Christianity was not affected in the way that they wanted. But then we end off with this story of Sosthenes. Sosthenes, the Roman or the Jewish synagogue ruler who brought this case probably to the tribunal. And it seems the audience was probably mostly Gentile that would have been listening to this, and maybe the Jewish people that came with him to bring the accusation. But things became hostile against Sosthenes in particular. Whether it was the Jews who became hostile against him, or whether it was the Gentile audience around them that became hostile against the Jews in general, it's not clear. But things turned nasty for Sosthenes. And whether it was because he failed to present his case, and then the Jewish group that had come with him turned on him and then beat him up in front of the tribunal, or whether it was the Gentiles who did that. Remember, Gentile society in Corinth did not want Jewish contentions bothering them. They had seen this sort of thing happening in Rome, and the general atmosphere was hostile against Jews. If you can imagine, more and more Jews were coming into Corinth, and they had been sent away from Rome because they were troublesome in Rome. now they are in Corinth, and if you can imagine them feeling like now you want to start causing problems here as well. And Sosthenes got beaten up, but it's interesting that there's a Sosthenes who's mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 1. 1 Corinthians 1:1 talks about Paul and Sosthenes writing a letter to the church in Corinth. And it's interesting whether this is the same Sosthenes who was beaten or it's another Sosthenes. It's not clear. Maybe that beating was useful. Maybe made him come to his senses and come to the Lord after he got a few blows to the head. But anyway, it's a bit of a funny story how this thing just turned around, and the leader of the Jewish the Jewish synagogue ruler, the leader of this whole charge against Paul, ends up being beaten up in front of the tribunal. And of course Gallio doesn't want to be bothered by it. He just ignores them and leaves them. They're just doing their drama in front of him, and he walks away. It's nothing, it's trivial as far as he's concerned. He's not going to bother himself with these trivialities. So that is how this whole thing ends. Gallio says, I'm not wasting my time with these trivialities, I'm going. And they do everything they want to do, but he just ignores them anyway. Very brief in this description, this whole chapter, you find there's a lot of ground that Luke covers, but it's done in very brief segments, and he very quickly says a lot in chapter 18. And we're going to see that even as we get towards the end of chapter 18, because quickly we see the third journey, the beginning of the third journey just happens towards the end of chapter 18. But I'm moving ahead of myself now. I think let's stop here. I just want to mention one more thing, that Gallio was proconsul from AD 51 to 52. And that is a very important date, because that then helps scholars to date Paul's travels, because you can then be sure that, okay, this incident happened around 51, 52 AD, and then you can go backwards and forwards to date Paul's travels based on the clear date that we have in this portion of Scripture. That's just a bit of scholarly, what do you call it? Some of us, we want to get really deep. We are geeks. Scholars, kind of my computer geeks, you want to get into detail, get to know all these little issues. But that's a little detail that might be useful for you. Gallio was proconsul from 51 to 52 AD. That helps us date Paul's travels. And for what that's worth, that will end our session today. You are blessed. Continue blessed, continue in God's favor.